Alright, hey everyone! This is actually the first time that I'm ever doing a video like this, so this is definitely going to be interesting for me. I'm hoping to make a couple more videos like this at some point in the future. I know it's not really my thing, but I just got a new camera and a tripod, and I'm really excited to try everything out. Today we are going to be going over South Park. And the reason that I wanted to do this is because at this point I would kind of consider myself a South Park expert. I've basically seen all of South Park and all of its content, like even the games, so I would say that I'm pretty qualified to talk about it if anybody is. So yeah, today I'm going to be recounting the entirety of Season 1 of South Park and possibly more in the future, and you're free to come along with me for the ride. Basically how this is going to work is I'm going to be sitting down and talking to you in between watching episodes of South Park. So I'm going to watch an episode and then I'm going to come chat with you guys about everything that happened in the episode, and we're going to talk about it and like maybe if it's warranted, like the historical context of the episode, because in some cases that can be very important. There's a couple episodes that I'm thinking of in particular, and just like the general reaction to certain episodes. This is going to be a complete guide to South Park, because I know a lot of people probably don't feel that it's a very approachable show, which I think is kind of unfortunate, because I genuinely do think that South Park has some ingenious moments in it, and I think that those really great episodes, and of which there are some kind of shit episodes, I can't lie. Like, I love the show very dearly. Sometimes they miss, but when they hit really well. So let's talk about South Park. Alright, so I think that before we actually get into me watching the episodes and like relaying all of this information to you, I think that we should start with some background information before we get into it. So I guess the first thing that I want to explain to you guys is the main characters. And I mean, some of you probably already know this, they're pretty iconic, but if you don't, it's still here for you, and maybe there are some things that you never noticed about their character that I can teach you. So I guess the first person that we're going to talk about is Kyle, because he's sort of like one of the two, well, like there's four main characters truly, but like Stan and Kyle are the main characters, because sometimes, most of the time, Cartman ends up being an antagonist, and then Kenny's just kind of, like, I love him, but he's just kind of there to die, and I think we all knew that about him, so it's fine. But anyway, we have to start talking about Kyle. So something that I would note about Kyle is he's sort of the kind of character that does the wrong thing for the right reasons. And this is me like almost directly quoting a great South Park YouTuber that I would totally suggest you check out, because honestly a lot of the information I learned about South Park came from his channel, so I would totally check him out. He's very cool, and he is definitely like one big component of this video and why I wanted to make it in the first place. So go check him out, he seems very cool. But yeah, he's sort of the kind of character that always has good intentions, and sometimes that leads him to do some really f***ed up things, and that kind of happens a lot. But for all intents and purposes, Kyle and Stan are very similar characters. Kind of the difference between them, and I guess we'll talk about Stan now. Stan is more the kind of guy that does the right thing for the wrong reasons. And why I say that is because generally Stan is pretty helpful, but most of the time, like, he kind of doesn't really care enough. Like, he kind of has this I don't give a fuck attitude towards most things, and I think that causes him to be very indifferent and sometimes really hostile, maybe unintentionally, and there's definitely some very good examples of that within the show. But he's definitely like kind of another side to the coin with him and Kyle, for sure. They're definitely like a dynamic duo, for sure. When you're talking about Kyle, you have to talk about Stan and vice versa. So now we have to get into some other characters, so I guess we'll talk about Kenny next. That should be relatively brief. Which is really upsetting because Kenny actually means a lot to me. Kenny, for the most part, exists for I guess, like, comic relief. Like, it's a comedy show, but him and Cartman are kind of like the comic relief. And Kenny especially, because often he's saying things that are muffled, but they're, like, really vulgar. I know a lot of people, like, probably don't watch the show with subtitles. I like to watch it with subtitles, and sometimes on Paramount Plus, which is where I watch it, the subtitles will actually, like, tell you what Kenny's really saying, and it's really insane. Like, some of the shit that he says is so fucked up, because they're 4th graders, or, well, okay, in the first season, in the first, like, 4 seasons, they're 3rd graders, but they will be 4th graders for, like, most of the show, so just, like, keep that in mind. They are very young children, which I think was kind of obvious, but it needs to be stated. And the other part about Kenny is that he dies in every episode in the early seasons, and they did, like, Matt and Trey, the creators, Matt Stone and Trey Parker, creators of South Park, creators of the Book of Mormon as well. They're very funny guys. I would definitely look into them a little bit because they've done some fascinating things in public before, but specifically talking about the Oscars. But we'll get into that at a later time. That is not right now's conversation. Matt and Trey got kind of bored of the killing Kenny bit after a while, justifiably, and, like, we'll talk about it. But Kenny dies, and that's, like, the other half of his character. And finally, we gotta talk about our last main character, Eric Cartman. His first name is not Cartman, it's his last name. I feel like that just needs to be said for the few of us out there that don't know his first name's Eric, and also for the people who know full well that his first name is Eric, but still in their brain think that he's Cartman. He's Cartman, obviously. I am one of those people as well, so don't feel too called out if that's you. I get it. Sometimes I forget that he has a first name and I get jump scared by it, like, Eric? Really? That's fun. But anyway, let's talk about Cartman. Eric Cartman is responsible for some of the show's most controversial jokes, and I think that's about the best way that I could put it. He's a known bigot of, like, everything, basically. And it's, like, a big part of his character. And he's also just all around, like, a really awful person. Like, he commits several actual crimes within the show. And there's, like, a list. And there's also another video by another South Park creator, Fox Catra, and I would totally recommend watching it if you want to learn more about Eric Cartman. But it basically just details every single crime Eric Cartman has committed, and then has, like, a psychological breakdown diagnosis situation of, like, what Cartman might have been going through because of all of this, and, like, taking the psychology route. It's a very interesting video, and I would totally recommend it. Another reason why I wanted to make this. But yes, Eric Cartman is both very bigoted and an actual criminal, and in 4th grade, so what can you do? But that's most of what I can say about him. He talks pretty funny, he's a bad person, he says fucked up things. What more can I say? And that concludes going over what I would say are the important characters for now. I mean, we'll get into the, like, I guess secondary characters while they come up, but I think that's all the beginning information that you guys will need from me. So, I guess that's my cue to go rewatch the first episode of South Park. I'll see you on the other side. Alright, so, I'm back, and wow, that was certainly something. Sometimes I forget how insane this show is. So, the first episode of South Park is called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. And yeah, he does. So, yeah, fair enough, exactly what it says on the tin. So I guess where we're gonna start with this episode is with the opening text. So every episode of South Park opens with this text. I gotta pull it up. Gotta pull it up on my laptop. All characters and events in this show, even those based on real people, are entirely fictional. All celebrity voices are impersonated, poorly. The following program contains coarse language and, due to its content, should not be viewed by anyone. So that's how every episode of South Park starts, and it is such a good tone to open on. And it's one of, like, since that's the first thing that you ever see of the show, like, it just really hits you. And speaking of the first thing that you see in the show, the opening is so good. It's funny, it's like, it's got the comedy in it, it's got fun character voices, it's just a banger. The opening of South Park is just so iconic. I'll play some of it for you now. And I would recommend, honestly, just going to listen to it. Or go watch the first episode of South Park. It's a good place to start. It's iconic. It introduces you to pretty much all of the characters you're gonna need to know for the first bit of the show. It's great. It's a good place to start, which is why we're starting with it here. Also, before we actually get into the contents of this episode, I just want to let you guys know before we get any further into it that I will not be explaining every episode in this much detail. The only reason that I'm explaining this one specifically, and why I will explain more in this amount of detail, why I'm explaining this one specifically and why I will end up explaining other episodes in this amount of detail is because some of them are just more significant to the show than others. Like, some of them are pretty self-explanatory and there's not a lot going on. For this one though, there's a lot of characters introduced, so I just want to make sure that I have time to talk about all of them so that you can get a good picture of the show. So where our episode opens is at the bus stop, which is a very familiar sight, and you're gonna get used to seeing it if you're watching the show. We have our four boys, Kyle, Stan, Kenny, and Cartman. I'm actually wearing Stan socks right now, you can't tell, but trust me, I'm wearing South Park socks. I got you. So our four protagonists are standing at the bus stop, and Kyle, his little brother, comes over. His little brother's name is Ike. You're probably familiar with him. And some interesting history behind his name and everything. A lot of people probably don't know this, but a fun fact about it is that the word Ike was actually, like, a long time ago. It's currently, like, not in usage, but it used to actually be like an offensive term or a slur for Jewish people, which is where, like, the K word comes from, if you know what I'm talking about, which I think is just a really interesting, like, tidbit of information, because something I actually forgot to mention about Kyle earlier is that a big part of his character is he's Jewish, and the show makes a lot of jokes about it. The show also makes a lot of really important points about him being Jewish, and it's very fascinating, and it's very well done. And he's honestly, like, I think a well done and represented character, as most communities are really represented in this show, which I think a lot of people don't really understand, because it kind of gets swept away with the whole, oh, you know, it's the kind of offensive humor sort of show. So enough about that. Ike comes over and he's trying to go to school with them, and then we get introduced to a recurring bit in the show, which is kick the baby. This is another thing that you might have heard of. And then Cartman actually, another, like, recurring joke for this specific episode is Cartman calling, and other people calling people dildos, because Cartman is like, oh, Ike, you're a dildo, or something like that. And then it's either Kyle or Stan is like, oh, what is that? And then Kenny explains it. But it's, like, muffled so you can't hear it. And then after that, Cartman is, like, kind of talking about how he was, like, having a dream and how he was kidnapped by aliens in the dream, and they were, like, doing some sort of surgery on them. And then Kyle's like, no dude, that totally really happened. They're visitors. Here we have another one of our kind of recurring characters in the show, which is the visitors. They don't really show up by name very often, but this is one of the episodes where they do show up by name and are referenced and are also present, which doesn't happen a lot. Generally, the visitors are just hidden in the background as, like, a little Easter egg when you're watching some of the episodes, but the visitors are, like, kind of important because they are, like, technically a mainstay, even though they're not really plot relevant most of the time. And then after that, while they're still at the bus stop, Chef pulls up, and Chef is another really important addition to this cast. Like, we're just bam, 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 being introduced to so many characters so quickly, but honestly, it feels so natural. Like, when I'm relaying this to you, I feel like it feels very quick, but when you're watching the show, it actually feels paced very well. which is something just to note. So Chef rolls up. Chef is hilarious. I love him so much. He is basically just known for, like, the kids will come up to him and be like, "Hey, Chef," and he'll be like, "How's it going?" And they'll be like, "It's going good," or "It's going bad," and he'll be like, "Oh, why?" And then he'll like sing love songs to them. We'll get to it. It'll happen later in this episode. Don't you worry. So then Chef is like, "Oh, y'all are talking about visitors. Oh, those are real," because Chef is like hardcore a believer. He's tinfoil hat about the visitors. And to be fair, he has a valid reason. The visitors did kidnap Cartman and give him an anal probe, hence the name of the episode. But then their school bus pulls up, and we have an introduction of another important character, at least for the first few seasons, Mrs. Crabtree. She is their very cranky bus driver, and she's kind of hard of hearing, which in the earlier seasons they use her like inability to hear to make some jokes with Stan. So he'll say something about her being a fat bitch, and then he'll say like, "Oh, I have a bad itch." It's very funny.
"Well, we can't do anything for now. That fat bitch won't let us." "What did you say?" I said that rabbits eat lettuce." "Oh."
It's very, very well done. I love those jokes, and when they stopped appearing I was kind of sad. But Miss Crabtree also disappears later in the show. We'll get to it. I'll get into it. And then basically before they get on the bus, Kyle kicks Ike one more time and he ends up on the other side of the bus. But I think he ends up also like running after the bus. I don't know, just like trust, go with it, just go with it. So now when they're on the bus, there's a fart joke because of course there is at South Park. That's another kind of like mainstay of the series, is that Matt and Trey love a good toilet humor joke. And I get why people don't like it. I really do. And sometimes it feels a little like, oh, overdone or just not that funny. But sometimes it is funny. Like, I like Terrence and Phillip, and like, we'll get into Terrence and Phillip, but Terrence and Phillip, just for those who don't know, are just where most of the toilet humor from the show comes from. But they're very funny at times, and I think it can be used well. It isn't all the time. I will be the last person to say that it's just like, oh, it's perfect. No, it's not a perfect show, and nothing is, so. And then literally just they look out the back window of the bus and Ike is being kidnapped by the visitors, so now he's kidnapped. And then we cut to like the farm where all the cows are in South Park, and cows are actually pretty important to South Park as well, because the elementary school, like South Park Elementary's like team, or I guess like their mascot is the cows. They're the cows. So like when they play sports or whatever. And then you'll have like the girls be dressed up in their little cheerleader outfits being like, "Go cows," that kind of thing. So the cows keep dying. Specifically what they refer to it as in the show is being turned inside out, which is kind of crazy. But the cows are dying, and the farmer is asking the police chief, who is Officer Barbrady, or at least I think he's the chief. I don't know. He just seems to be the only... No, he's actually not the chief. I'm wrong. Oh my god, I'm wrong. The chief is the ginger guy. I don't think he was introduced. Unless I'm... No, he might have been. He might have been in this episode. Fuck, I can't remember. This is the upside of me having like watched it right before, is that we have to deal with my terrible memory. So this is always just gonna give you more incentive to just watch the show yourself, because I am not a reliable narrator. But yeah, Officer Barbrady is like, I guess one of the main police officers that like is recurring, and kind of his whole character is that he's like really fucking dumb, and that's basically just the point. But he's like, "Girl, I don't know what's happening about the cows. I can't help you." And then we cut to the classroom where we get Mr. Garrison. Everybody get excited. Mr. Garrison is probably the second most common source of controversial jokes for the show. Mr. Garrison is just also a very bigoted person, like specifically a very racist person. So they use Mr. Garrison to talk about that a lot. Like, a lot, very frequently. And also, with some of the stuff that he's just teaching the kids in this episode, they're doing it then too. They really are, with the stuff that he's saying. And honestly, for this scene, I don't even think I can do it justice. It is just, like, probably one of the more iconic scenes in the series. It is fucking phenomenal. Alright, so there were a couple things that I missed when I was first recording this that I have no idea, honestly, how I even skipped over them. So, the first important thing about Mr. Garrison's character that I feel like I should have mentioned is Mr. Hat. I don't even know how I missed that. He was fully in the episode. He yells at Kyle! The long and short of it is that Mr. Garrison is basically convinced that Mr. Hat is like a living entity, and I mean, Mr. Hat kind of is implied to be a living entity. There are some points in the show where Mr. Hat escapes from Mr. Garrison and like does things on his own, and he seems to have different thoughts and feelings than Mr. Garrison, but we'll get into that later. The final thing that I don't know how I missed about Garrison is that he's gay. That's like really important. Okay, edit MCAM interjection over. So, Cartman is still, like, going around farting fire. Like, even outside, he keeps farting fire. So, like, poor guy, I guess? Cartman is farting fire in the cafeteria, and we run into another important character, Wendy Testaburger. So, to talk about her, we have to talk about Stan. Because for a good portion of the show, Wendy and Stan have been dating, and they actually, I believe, start dating after this episode? Question mark? Like, I could be wrong, but they do, like, they definitely in this episode, like, they like each other before this episode, obviously, but I think this episode is when they actually probably start dating, at least in my mind. I'll let you know if that changes, if in my mind palace that changes. But yeah, if we're gonna talk about Wendy, we have to talk about her and Stan. They have an interesting relationship. Like, oftentimes, like, Stan, I kind of went over this, Stan's kind of an asshole. And the thing about Wendy is that, Wendy Testaburger, she stops being, like, a boring, blank slate character after a certain amount of time, and then starts being, like, the politically correct character. Like, she starts being the voice of the left in the show, fully. And they definitely do use her very well in a lot of cases, and even to show, like, hypocrisy within the far left that can exist as well. I think she's a very well done character. I do like her a lot. I know some people hate her. Some people really hate Wendy. I don't know why. She's just kind of trying her best. Like, she's not a perfect person, but they're f***ing children, first of all. And second of all, they're also just, like, not real, so I don't know why it matters. And I've always said that. Oh, and then something really important to mention, actually, that I can't believe I forgot to mention at all thus far. Every time that Stan talks to Wendy, he throws up in her face.
Here, Stan. This is for you. Ew!
I don't know why, but it is a recurring joke in this show for some reason. He gets over it eventually because obviously they start dating, but still, it's like a thing. So obviously because she's here, he throws up on her face because he tries to talk to her. Good job, Stan. And then when they're trying to, like, give him some advice for, like, going to ask her out or something, Kenny says something muffled, and then Stan's like, what? How do you even know she has a cat? And I was just like, like, hello? So the show does that sometimes too. As I was kind of mentioning earlier, Kenny will say something really out of pocket, and then you'll figure it out through, like, context clues or the subtitles. So they run into Chef again because they're, like, in the lunch line because they're in the cafeteria. And Chef does his serenading that I so helpfully mentioned earlier. And I can play some of it for you. This is a very iconic song. But after Chef, like, serenades them fully with a song about making love to a woman, which I guess is useful for Stan. I think that's why. And, like, I get, they kind of mention it later and they're like, oh wow, thanks, Chef. But, like, after that, they're talking about visitors with Chef again, and then the anal probe fully comes out of Cartman's ass. Because of course it does. So we have, like, actual confirmation, besides the fact that Cartman has been farting fire for the past 5 minutes within the show. And apparently this was the point that I realized that not only does the font on Chef's apron that says Chef change in, I think, all of the shots, but I also noticed that in that shot specifically, when he's serenading them with his song about I'm gonna make love to you, woman, when that one, that it was the Brat font. That was the Brat font. We live in a simulation. So, Cartman likes to keep denying that he's, like, had the anal probe and he thinks it's all a dream. And he's, like, having his little shit fit about, I'm not being taken over by aliens. And then he gets possessed by an alien and starts singing and dancing. So. Okay, King. And then Kenny dies. He gets run over, like, 3 times. And then he dies. So yeah, as we'll come to learn, oh my god, they killed Kenny, you bastards, is also a recurring joke in the show, alongside the whole Kenny dying bit. And that will also come up every time Kenny dies, and Kenny dies a lot. So, note that. And then, of course, how could I forget? Rats start swarming Kenny. This is another thing that is recurring within the show, and within Kenny's deaths. And then we meet Leanne Cartman, Eric Cartman's mother. One of the first things that she says in this show to Cartman is, "You're not fat, you're big boned." And if you wanted to know anything about Cartman and why he is the way he is, his mother. It's because of his mother. A lot of his bigotry, pretty much all of his bigotry actually, and just like him being enabled by his mother, it's all her fault. And the show very much wants to make that clear. And some other, kind of interesting things about Leanne is that she's also a sex worker, which is kind of like an important part of her character. Sort of. It's only ever brought up for, like, the purpose of jokes. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's supposed to be, like, the purpose of Leanne Cartman being a sex worker and being portrayed as one within the show is not for the purposes of advocating for the safety and health of sex workers, which I think should be mentioned while we're talking about this show. It is often played for the joke of, haha, your mom's a whore, which I think can be examined. I don't think that in this case it's supposed to be taken that negatively. But I also think that this isn't like a nuanced conversation. Anyway, moving on from that, we're at Stark's Pond now with Kyle and Stan. They're waiting for Wendy Testaburger, and, well, like, Stan's gonna throw up on her face. We already know that. And then we get another cut back to the Cartman's house, and we get to meet Mr. Kitty, which is the Cartman's cat. Something interesting about Mr. Kitty is that Mr. Kitty has both been proven to be a girl cat and a boy cat at different periods of time, so it is most likely that Mr. Kitty is actually intersex, which I think is really interesting. But yeah, we have the "No Kitty, this is my pot pie" scene. Take it away. You guys deserve to see this one.
No, Kitty, this is my pot pie.
And we cut back to Stark's Pond. Wendy is helping them brainstorm for how they can potentially remedy the situation that they're in, presumably being the fact that Cartman has an alien anal probe that can control him. Doesn't sound very good. And their solution is to use him for bait. So they tie him to a tree, and then they figure out that that anal probe is actually an 80-foot satellite dish.
I'm sick of it. It's completely amateur. Hey, it's happening again. Whoa, look at that. Now do you believe us, Cartman? You guys can't scare me. I know you're making it all up. Cartman, there's an 80-foot satellite dish sticking out of your ass.
And then once they lure the visitors there with Cartman and his anal probe, Kyle ends up cussing them out after, like, relaying this heartfelt speech about, like, him and family and everything. And then they're just like, man, humans kind of fucking suck. And then he's like, yeah, and he just starts cussing them out, and it's great. King. So after Kyle cusses out the visitors, they end up seeing Ike up in the UFO that's still in the air, and Kyle's like, Ike, you gotta jump, and like he won't do it because that's crazy. But then what makes Ike finally jump to safety from the UFO of the visitors is, and I quote, "Do your impression of David Caruso's career." And Ike says, "It's my turn," and then he fucking jumps. Like, how crazy is that? That's so insane. And then while this is all happening, the visitors are actually talking to the cows of South Park, and they're like, moo moo, moo moo moo, and they're like communing with the cows, and they're like, hey, you guys are actually the most intelligent species on Earth, and we want to give you something. So they give them a gift. And what this turns out to be is something that can possess human beings to sing and dance like Cartman was earlier. How beautiful. Intergalactic relations, am I right? So after all this happens, Cartman is eventually dragged up into space with the visitors. And then we cut back to the bus stop, but this time it's only Kyle and Stan. And they're like, we're running out of friends. And then Cartman appears again, but he's looking a little off. And he's like, guys, I had another dream that I was taken back up to space. And then Scott Baio gave him pink eye. And then they're like, Cartman, that wasn't a dream. And he was like, then why don't I have pink eye? And they're like, Cartman, you do have pink eye. And that is how the first episode of South Park concludes. So that concludes our journey examining the first episode of South Park. The first episode of South Park will always hold a special place in my heart. It's funny, it's iconic, and all around I think it's a really great place to start if you're looking for somewhere to start getting into South Park. Thank you so much for coming along for the ride with me. I'll see you guys all next time when I come out with another part. Bye, and thanks for watching.